This is our next topic, which is attachment. Our first lesson is caregiver-infant interaction, and this is on paper 1. So for paper 1 you should have memory, social, psychopathology and attachment. So in this lesson we're going to go over what caregiver-infant interactions are. There's a few key words that you'll see that I've put at the bottom of the PowerPoint slides that you need to be aware of from this lesson. So we have attachment, reciprocity, and interactional synchrony. And there's some key research which is melts off and more. So these will be on every slide, and I'll start doing that from now on as well. So if you want to start a keyword glossary, you can use the key terms off the PowerPoint slides, and if you want like a key research glossary, you can use the key research off each of the lessons as well. So to start off with, just a little activity to get you thinking. So define the word infant and caregiver. What's the difference between an infant and a caregiver? What roles does an infant have? What role does a caregiver have? Think about how infants and caregivers communicate and how psychologists might study this communication. So just a couple of minutes, have a read through, try and answer as many of those questions as you can. Okay, so a caregiver would be the person that gives care. This care would be in the form of like the basic needs. So if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they would provide those basic needs. So they would provide food, they would provide water, they would also provide some emotional needs as well. So they would provide support, they would give love as well. So emotional care, they would give that as well. How do they communicate? So if we're thinking about infants, the majority of their communication will be non-verbal. So they will communicate like through crying, through laughing, through movements in their body as well. And how might psychologists study this? So the majority of psychological research is observational, and they'll use behavioural categories. So that's what we did when we looked at content analysis. So they'll often use a content analysis or a thematic analysis when they're looking at infant caregiver interactions. So here I've got a little bit of information for us just to get us started. So like I just mentioned, the key interaction between infants and caregivers is non-verbal communication. And this communication forms the basis of lots of important things such as an attachment. An attachment is a strong emotional bond between an infant and their caregiver. So that's a key thing that you need to be aware of. You need to have a definition of attachment, and you need to know that an attachment is a strong emotional bond. That's key. It has to be strong and it has to be emotional. That's the key thing for you to remember here. So you can write that down, that definition. You'll see some images as well of some different non-verbal communication from infants. Babies are very expressive with their faces because this is one of their key methods of communication. Okay, so just to recap, key thing that we've got so far is the definition of attachment. So an attachment is a strong emotional bond between an infant and their caregiver. Okay. Often psychological research refers to the mother as the primary caregiver, but just for the definition in general, we're just looking at caregiver. It doesn't specify gender. So there's two types of infant caregiver interaction that we're going to look at in the lesson. Reciprocity is the first, and then we're going to look at interactional synchrony. So reciprocity. This is the idea that babies move in a rhythm when they interact with an adult. So they take turns and they have conversations with adults. On the assignment, I have attached a video that you might want to watch of a baby. There's so many that you can find on YouTube acting this way with their caregiver. So it's the idea that a baby might babble and then wait for you to respond. So you would say something and then the baby would babble again, and it's kind of like a conversation develops between an infant and their caregiver. So I've got a definition of reciprocity here. So it is responding to the action of another with a similar action. So if they make a noise, you respond with a noise. If they make a movement, you respond with a movement. It's not exactly the same, it's just similar. And that's what you need to remember. It's a similar response, but it's not exact. It's not an exact response. It's not exactly the same as what that person does, because that's synchrony. So if you watch the clip, you'll see that example of reciprocity, and the clip should explain it a lot more than I can, without having an infant to show you that interaction. Within reciprocity, it's important to be aware that babies have alert phases. This is where a baby would indicate to you that they are ready to have some kind of interaction, they're ready to start a conversation, and this could be through making eye contact with you. So they make eye contact with you, you say something, and then they start to babble, and then you've got that conversation going on. What's important to remember as well is that it shows that babies and caregivers are both actively involved in this. Previously, it was believed that babies were passive and they didn't necessarily engage in reciprocity, but because they have an alert phase, it shows that they're initiating that conversation and they want to get you talking to them. There's an advertisement that I've seen on television more recently, and that's about adults talking to their babies. I'll see if I can find a link to it, and I'll put that on the assignment as well. It's just encouraging parents to interact with their babies and talk to their babies, to develop an attachment through reciprocity. So key things to remember: reciprocity is like a conversation where an infant and a caregiver take turns. Infants have alert phases which show that they are actively involved, and an example of an alert phase would be making eye contact with their caregiver. Now we have interactional synchrony. So this is the idea that when two people interact with each other, they mirror what that other person is doing. So this could be not only emotions but behaviours as well. With regards to emotions, it's kind of like you smile at somebody and they smile back to you. That's an example of synchrony. I've got a definition of synchrony here. So when an infant and caregiver mirror one another's actions and emotions in a synchronised way. It's kind of like you smile, then the baby smiles. Other examples that have been used are you stick your tongue out and then the baby sticks their tongue out. You yawn, then the baby yawns. Or you might sort of like wave and then the baby will make a similar movement at the same time. So this is an example of synchrony. The difference between reciprocity and synchrony might make more sense when we do an exam question in a little bit. But reciprocity is conversation, and synchrony is when you're in sync with someone, so you're doing something exactly the same way and you're mirroring that person. So research suggests that synchrony is important for developing attachments. This study found that if there are higher levels of synchrony between a mother and her infant, then she is more likely to have a strong emotional bond and a better quality attachment with her infant. So it shows that synchrony is important. It shows that this mirroring of emotions and behaviours helps to develop a bond between an infant and their caregiver. So to sum that bit up, interactional synchrony is when you mirror emotions and behaviours. An example is you smile, then the baby smiles, and it's important for attachment. We have some research to support interactional synchrony. This is Meltzoff and Moore. This is the idea that they were trying to test whether an infant would imitate behaviours. So they got an adult model And you can see the images at the bottom. They displayed one of 3 faces or hand movements, and they placed the dummy in the infant's mouth while they were displaying these movements, so sticking their tongue out, and the baby would have the dummy in, and then they would take the dummy out and they would see whether that baby imitated that behaviour. Again, there's a video clip of this as well attached to the assignment, so you can have a look and you can see that in action, and it will make more sense as well. So they found that there was an association between the infant's behaviour and the adult's model. They found that infants as young as 2 to 3 weeks old imitated specific facial and hand gestures which showed interactional synchrony. So they found support for interactional synchrony, and you can see there some of the images of the adult model and the baby imitating their behaviours, or mirroring, their behaviours. Okay, so that's your key piece of research. So just to recap, Meltzoff and Moore showed interactional synchrony. But if we think about that study, there are some issues with the validity. So if we're thinking about it in terms of what type of validity, it would be the internal validity. So are they actually measuring what they set out to measure? When we think about babies, their mouths are constantly moving, and we don't know whether that baby is intentionally imitating that behaviour or if it just happens by accident. So we can't actually work out whether we're measuring what we are supposed to be measuring. Then if we think about a positive, it's scientific, it's controlled, and because it's a controlled observation, we can establish cause and effect. So that's a good thing. We can say that we believe that this adult model is having this effect on this infant, and therefore we have some strong support for the idea of interactional synchrony. So now we've got some exam practice, and like I said, it might make more sense when you've had a go at this question. So have a read through that. It's 4 marks, it should take you about 5 minutes. So pause it, have a read and have a go at the question. Okay, so if we're thinking about this, we can split the item into 2. So we've got the part where they smile and they smile back. So the caregiver smiles and the baby smiles back. And then we've got the next bit where it says that when the caregiver moves her head, then the baby moves her head at exactly the same time, and it seems as if they're one person. So we can split it into 2 parts there. So if we look at the mark scheme, first of all, what you have to do is you have to define the 2 terms. So you would have to say, in the item there is an example of interactional synchrony. This is when adults and babies respond in time, or just give me the definition that we've used previously for that. And you could say an example of this is they move as if they were one person, or they move perfectly in time with one another. Then in the next part you would talk about reciprocity. You would say reciprocity is when the infant and caregiver take turns and interact with each other like a conversation. This can be seen as the caregiver smiles and the baby smiles back. So mark your answer, see what you got wrong, what you need to improve, and make any improvements now. So next we're going to do some evaluation. I've kind of done a little bit of a different way of evaluating this, because a lot of the exam questions focus on how we research infant caregiver interactions and the problems with the ways in which we research it. So it links really well to methods, and they use quite a lot of methods questions in this. So I've done problems with researching, and then strengths of the way that we research, and then I've done some other issues that we need to consider. So it's a little bit lengthy, this evaluation. So the first one, this is one whole point, but I've split it down because there's quite a lot of detail in there. And it links to that idea of the internal validity of the research. Because babies can't communicate, we have to make inferences. So we have to infer their behaviour. We have to kind of like guess what they're doing and guess the reasons why they're doing something, because they can't tell us that, and they can't sort of elaborate on what they've done or explain things to us. It could be, like I mentioned earlier, that the infants are just moving their mouths and just doing things that they would normally do, and they're not actually mimicking the caregiver. So it's hard for us to decide what is intentional and what is just happening by accident. So we don't know if they're actually mirroring the behaviour. We don't know if that's an example of interactional synchrony, because we're just making inferences. So it affects the internal validity of the research. We don't know if we're measuring what we set out to measure. So that's just one big point, okay? But split down into smaller sections. And then the next part, again, is problems, but we've got a few different ones here. So there's practical issues. When we're studying babies, babies aren't awake for very long. When they're like 2 or 3 weeks old, they might only be awake for an hour maximum at a time. Most of the time, babies are eating and sleeping. So that means that it's really hard for us to conduct research, especially if we have to kind of like wait a little bit to see if they give us a response. And if we're putting a dummy in their mouth while we're making a facial expression, that baby is potentially going to fall back to sleep. So it is difficult for us to conduct this research over a long period of time. Also, because they're highly controlled, then that's a problem as well, because it doesn't reflect their natural situation. It could be that the baby's just interacting that way, because of the situation that they're in, because of the environment, and they might not actually behave like that on a regular basis or in their natural setting. The next point is the idea that research is observational. So this is a problem because we might have some observer bias here. It might be that we're looking for behaviours to happen, and as soon as we see something that is potentially a behaviour, we jump straight on that, and we don't actually think, oh well, actually no, that might have been an accident. We kind of misinterpret things because they support our hypothesis. And then the final point is the idea that there hasn't been much research that has replicated the findings of Meltzoff law, but that could be due to the procedure, not because interactional synchrony doesn't exist. So to recap the problems, so the problems with research into infant-caregiver interaction, caregiver-infant interaction, is we have internal validity. We don't know whether we're inferring behaviours and whether those behaviours are actually demonstrations of synchrony or not. We don't know if they're intentional or not. We have practical issues. Babies don't stay awake for very long, so it's really hard to conduct research. There's issues of ecological validity because it's done in a lab setting, and there's problems with bias because a lot of it is observation based. Now we have some strengths of caregiver-infant interaction. So it's good that we do research in a lab and we use film as well. We can capture this evidence, we can go back through this evidence, we can check our findings, we can get other observers to watch the film and see how they interpret it, and we can make sure that the research is reliable. In addition, because the research is controlled, we can establish cause and effect, which I mentioned earlier. And there are some other studies that do support the idea of interactional synchrony as a theory, and this research here is the idea that infants didn't always make a response to an object, they only specifically make responses to humans, and this therefore shows that interactional synchrony is something that is unique to infants and their caregivers, and therefore it could be something that is really important in terms of them forming other human attachments. So again, to recap, the strengths: it's highly controlled, So we can establish cause and effect, we can capture everything on film, we can check it for inter-rater reliability, and there's some research that supports the idea of interactional synchrony. So it does exist, and it is important, and it is unique between infants and their caregivers. So now, they're the problems and the strengths of using this research, but some exam questions focus on how we can solve the issues with the research or the research methods. So what we could do is we could do it in a natural setting, so we could do it in their home. This would increase the internal validity, ecological validity. You could use more than one observer, or you could test inter-rater reliability or inter-observer reliability. You could do fewer, shorter observations, so make them quick, like 20 minutes, something like that, and only do like 1 or 2 a day. So this accounts for your shorter times that the baby is awake, and it means that that baby doesn't become distressed with the situation also. And the final one is making sure that we use ethical guidelines, so there's no harm to the child or their caregiver, and this harm doesn't necessarily have to be like within the study itself, it's also when the results are published. So we need to make sure things are anonymous, because if you find that your baby is behaving in a different way to other babies, then that could make you worry, and that could make other people judge you as a parent. So it's really important that research abides by confidentiality and data protection, and also protection from harm, so making sure that child doesn't become too distressed, and making sure that the caregiver is nearby if we're using someone different to make the gestures in the research. Okay, so our solutions: shorter sessions, fewer sessions, check for inter-rater reliability or inter-observer reliability, use a more natural setting, and make sure we use and follow ethical guidelines. These are the other evaluation issues that you need to consider. So the research might be socially sensitive, so this is the idea that interactional synchrony, it's important for attachment, and we found that out through research, but that means that if a mother returns to work when their infant is very young, then they might not be able to interact with their infant very often, and people might judge the mother for doing that, because you might think, well, if you're going back to work, then you're not going to form an attachment with your child, and that's not the right thing to do. So it can make mothers feel guilty for returning to work. And this has economical implications also. So we understand that caregiver-infant interaction is really important, and it's important for attachment, and attachment is important for long-term development, behavioural and emotional development, as you'll learn later on. So the government, they take on board this research, and then this can be linked to paternity and maternity leave. So with regards to maternity leave in the UK, women get maternity pay for 39 weeks, which allows them to stay at home and form attachments with their baby for a long period of time. This doesn't happen in all countries. I don't think it happens in the US. I don't think they get maternity pay for as long. So yeah, you can see that it has important economical implications there also. So to summarise, there's other evaluation points. It has economic implications, and we can link that to maternity leave. So we get longer maternity leave in the UK because it's important for the mother to stay at home and develop that attachment with their infant. And there's problems with social sensitivity. So this is an ethical issue, because mothers could feel guilty for going back to work because they're not forming an attachment with their infant if they're not involved in interactional synchrony or reciprocity for a prolonged period of time according to the research, and it could make other people judge mothers as well for returning to work. So finally, what we'll do to finish off is a couple of exam questions. So describe one way in which psychologists have investigated infant-caregiver interaction, refer to a specific study, and then evaluate this way of measuring or investigating infant-caregiver interaction. It says do not refer to ethical issues, so make sure you don't do that. So 6 marks, maybe 7 or 8 minutes. Have a go at those questions, and I'll put the mark scheme up in a second. Okay, so if we look at the mark scheme, you can see for the first question, you have to talk about a research study. The one that we've discussed in the lesson is Meltzoff and Moore. So you just have to outline the method that they used. You don't need to talk about aims or conclusion. You just need to talk about the method and the dependent variable. So what were they measuring and how did they measure that? And then for B, which was the evaluation, you can't use ethics. So you might have said that there's issues such as, like, if it's controlled, then there might be problems with ecological validity because it's an artificial setting. However, a good thing is that we can establish cause and effect. We're using inference for our findings. It's an observation, so there might be observer bias, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to do this time is each week do a quiz for the week's lessons. So this lesson will be combined with role of the father and stages of attachment in one big quiz. So do the other 2 lessons and then do the quiz at the end. Thank you.